Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today, where we're going to be focusing on rethinking content in the digital experience with a spotlight on this idea of a digital experience platform. And so for us, we've been doing lots of reading and seeing tons of stuff in the ecosystem from Forrester, Gartner, Real Story Group about this idea of a DXP. And so what we really want to cover is what's happening in the industry that has led us to this idea of a digital experience platform, and what does it actually mean for your business and for us here at Stantive. Just one second, sorry here. So before I introduce our speakers, there's just a couple housekeeping items I'd love to go through first. First and foremost, this session is being recorded, so anyone who's registered for this event will receive a copy of the recording as well as the presentation you see in front of you, and then we'll also package up some great supporting material and content and resources. So you can expect that from our team probably in the next couple days, so just look for that. So again, in terms of what we're covering today, for those of you who aren't familiar with our Spotlight series, one of the things that we try to do here at Stantive is we try to pick topics of, things that we're seeing trending in the ecosystem. But what we're doing this time is we're taking a little bit of a different approach. And so instead of doing a very structured webinar, what we're going to do is put our speakers on the spot a little bit. And we're going to have more of a dialogue. And so the bullets that you see in front of you definitely are going to be topics that we're going to cover today. And they really are going to serve as sort of the anchor or foundation point of the conversation. But we do want this to be organic. And we want it to be collaborative. So if at any point you have any questions or comments or feedback that you want to give to us, I'll be managing the chat feature and the question panel. So feel free to ask those at any time. And then whenever there's a natural break or pause in conversation, I'll try to ask them. If not, we will have a question answer period at the end of the webinar as well. And then we're just going to do a very quick kind of wrap up at the end. So our speakers for today. So for those of you who might not know me, my name is Kristen. I'm the digital marketing manager here at Stantive. I've been with Stantive for about 2 years now. I'm really, really excited about this topic and this webinar. And so today I'm going to be acting as facilitator meets chat manager meets MC. So again, if there's any questions or feedback throughout the presentation, do not hesitate to reach out. I'll be watching that closely. And then, for the real stars of the show today, I'm really excited to introduce Charlie, who is a principal analyst with Intellyx. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Intellyx, they're an analyst and advisory firm focused on agile digital transformation. And we at Stantive have worked with Intellyx for a couple years now. They're very active in the ecosystem. They write really, really great content. And so we're really lucky to be joined by Charlie today. And then, of course, we have our very own Doug Gervin, who is the founder and CEO at Stantive. And so whenever we can lock him in a room and get him to participate in something like this, we're always happy. So those are going to be the speakers today. And so maybe what I'll do is hand it over to Charlie to take over from here on out. And maybe I'll just manage the presentation from here, just for continuity's sake. Does that work?
Perfect.
Okay.
Sounds great. Thanks, Kristen. And it is very exciting to be with everybody here today. And I love talking about new topics. And this whole idea of the digital experience platform is one of those things that is new. And I think people are still trying to kind of get their head around it. And it's also, to a certain extent, a dangerous topic insofar as that it's easy to miss it. It's a subtle distinction, and yet it's one of those subtle distinctions that may be all important to organizations as they plot their path forward. And so this is one of those topics that I hope people kind of really grasp the importance of understanding what makes this unique and different. And I think, Doug, the place to start with this conversation, and as Kristen mentioned, by the way, let's definitely make this interactive. So if you have questions, I know we will have some time at the end, but don't hesitate. Bring them in there and get into this conversation. But Doug, let's start with this. For people maybe that don't understand exactly what a digital experience platform is or what that even means, and it will become more clear as we go through this conversation, but let's frame it a little bit. How would you define a digital experience platform? What does that mean from your perspective?
Thanks, Charlie, and it's great to be with everyone today. I think if we look at it's really an evolving definition. If we look at the industry analysts who are focused on this, they really see DXP, and it's very much what we're seeing as a platform that provides a collection of products and services that allows you to manage the digital experience of all of your customers, partners, employees across all of those digital touch points. And in the past, those touch points were pretty straightforward. They were sort of web, mobile, and general social, but the number of channels that we're seeing today are exploding just digitally alone without taking into account others. So it really is a cohesive platform that takes you from the back office out to all of your digital touch points with all of your stakeholders, be they customers, partners, or employees, and helps you manage their experience across all of those digital channels, both present and future.
Right, and that's actually, I think, so, well, obviously I agree with that, well, maybe not obviously, I mean, I agree with that definition, and yet I think that's part of the challenge, right? Because
Right.
in many ways, it would be easy for someone to hear that and go, well, wait a minute, isn't that what we've always done? But I think one of the reasons that it is fundamentally different is that there's this thing that we at Intellyx call the primacy of the customer, this idea that there's this fundamental shift that's occurring in really the balance of power. And so maybe that's the place to start this conversation. What do we mean by the primacy of the customer? What is the role that this shift plays in really kind of shaping why this whole digital experience platform is a critical thing that we now need?
I think, Charlie, I think the primacy of the customer, I think, is one of the great thought pieces that has come out of your firm. And one of the reasons for that is it is very multifaceted, and it's something that I think generates a lot of thinking, that needs to generate a lot of thinking in companies as they go forward. If we look at the last century, it looks a little, from a customer perspective, it's a bit like a power law distribution or 80-20 rule, that was epitomized for about 75% of the time by people like Henry Ford saying any color you like as long as it's black. And you sort of mass production, mass marketing, one size fits all, and that really was 75 years of the last 100. And that even 25 years ago, if you had 3 bank accounts, you got 3 form letters, 1 for each account, because to a bank you were an account. And that really only started to shift in the last 25 years. I think when we got to the big shift, though, started to happen when the dot-coms came along, and we suddenly started seeing sites like Amazon and eBay, where not only could you buy something, but you could also review something. You could review the seller, you could review the product or the service that you bought. And that allowed people to begin to have a voice, customers to have a voice in the actual process, and other customers be able to relate very quickly to it. But even those were pretty confined to a single platform. If you look at the ubiquity now of social platforms like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and others, and more are coming every day, those platforms allow consumers and stakeholders in general to coalesce around communities of interest. And those communities of interest can be a product or service. And so suddenly your brand is something people can coalesce around on platforms that you no longer control. And they can reach millions, or even in the case of Facebook, billions of people instantaneously with that voice. And so all of a sudden there's this seismic shift in the last 5 to 10 years where customers are really finding their voice, and brands are realizing that they really live at the beck and call of those customers who are organizing on those platforms.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that is that, again, why I really, hit this hard about some of these, and the next topic we're going to talk about as well is very similar, is that it doesn't sound that significant. It doesn't sound like it's that big of a deal. I mean, we've been dealing with social, really. I mean, Facebook is I think what really changed the kind of the face, no pun intended, of the way that brands have to interact socially. But even then, it was kind of this idea that, oh, well, I just have to control the message. And I think there is this fundamental shift that's been happening very subtly over the last, and I would argue it's only been the last couple of years that this has really started to take root, where that balance of power has in fact shifted, where, it did used to be that if I'm the customer, or if I'm the company, that because I own so much of the market, or because I had this unique product, that I controlled the terms of the engagement. And to the point of everything you're talking about, this isn't just about social. This isn't just about the fact that someone can, make a post on Facebook or tweet something out and get, there can be this backlash. It's really about the fact that that I want to, as the customer, I want to engage with you in the way I want to engage with you. And it doesn't mean I'm even upset or that anything is wrong. It just means that I'm now in control. And if you don't allow me to engage with you the way I want to engage with you, then guess what? I'll go someplace else. I don't have to buy from you. And I think that's the big shift. And I think that's where people kind of get their, can sometimes have this disconnect. It's like, well, wait a minute, the customer's always been in charge, right? I mean, the customer always had the ability to buy or not buy. But I think it's the way it worked is that once the customer decided they were interested, there was this defined flow that I could put them in. I could say, here's a sales funnel, and you're going to start here, and you're going to go through these 10 steps, and at the end of it, as long as we don't lose you along the way, you're going to buy. And so, yeah, you were in control, and that you could pull yourself out of that funnel. But I think what's fundamentally different in what you're explaining now, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that you can throw that away, because this idea of the primacy of the customer, it has shifted the way that people interact with the brand or with the sales cycle, whatever. And it's not just about sales, it's about the support cycle, all of it, in that it's the customer who's deciding how they want to interact. And if you don't step up and help them interact that way or allow them to go down that road, then you're in trouble. I mean, is that kind of how you're seeing all of that?
Absolutely. And I would even take it a step further in the thought that, once we've decided how we're going to interact with that brand, we also expect that brand to know us going forward across a multitude of channels. And so I think, you make a really good point, Charlie, but I would even say now, once you've been able to accommodate my point of view in terms of how I'd like to engage, I also expect that engagement to be a much longer lasting than the actual transaction through whatever channel we do it. So I'm expecting you to actually know me going forward, because one of the things about all of these platforms is we're giving a lot of information about ourselves away, and both our identity as well as the preferences that we're exhibiting through these platforms in terms of engagement. So we expect that, the flip side of that is you need to know me going forward, and you need to know me across the many channels that we're going to interact, because it also is no longer a unichannel kind of environment. It's not just me walking into the store or going to the website. It's a myriad of different ways I'm going to interact with you.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue, and to, I think, the next really important, almost the flip side of this coin, and it is this idea of omni-channel, right? Because as the customer is choosing where they want to interact, then the question is, how do we enable that, right? And again, this on a very simple level, this is nothing new. And that's where I think people can get lost in this or can miss it, right? Because since the advent of the internet and of websites, we've had this multi-channel kind of an approach where you had to have a website, and if you were in a physical business, you had to have your physical, and you might have, if you're in a B2B, maybe you have salespeople, and there were these different channel connection points and that we've had to manage. And I think, clearly now social is another channel, but this idea of omni-channel is in fact something different, right? It's not just the fact that you've got all these channels. So maybe again, let's start with the definition. I mean, what does omni-channel mean from your perspective, Doug?
I think omni-channel means more than anything else. So obviously there's a myriad of channels. You've talked about several. The digital channels explosion is obviously another piece of that. But the omni piece of this is sort of omnipresent, which means that, across all of those channels, back to my bank example earlier, what I said, you get 3 accounts, you got 3 letters. The problem with the multi-channel world that we've traditionally lived in is when I walk into a store, that store salesperson that I'm dealing with may have no idea of my purchase history on the web and no idea of my preferences based on things I've been saying on Facebook. So the challenge with multi-channel is if you go across an organization, those channels are typically managed in different silos across the organization. So, store operations manages the stores, and partner marketing manages distributors, and the digital team manages the website. But the question now is, how do we bring all of those together so that there is a single understanding of who I am as that customer? So again, I've chosen my point of engagement, the way I want to engage. To your point, to my previous point, we want to continue that engagement past a single transaction. And now, because of all these ways that I can interact with you, everybody across and all of the systems across those touch points needs to know about you in a way that's unified or omnipresent, if you will. And that's really the basis of omni-channel. We move to a point where we can see everything.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, you bring up retail, and retail is one of my favorite areas to pick on when it comes to the whole omni-channel thing, because I'm not actually positive if omni-channel came from the retail space, if that's where the term first took root or not, but it's certainly, you know, one of the industries that's been talking about omni-channel for a long time, and almost universally has completely failed at executing it. You know, to that point, right? You're doing all this stuff online. You walk in the store, and it's like an entirely different experience. They have no idea who you are for the most part. And there's some companies that do a better job at this than others, but it's a very, you know, as the customer, it's an extremely frustrating experience. And you know, going all the way back to link it, why this is a fundamentally, you know, a fundamentally different approach, or a fundamental shift in the way organizations have to think about it, how they have to be structured and organize it, is the reason that you just pointed out, is that those, you know, when you have a multi-channel strategy, it's because you're organizing it as a business to your benefit, right? It makes easier, more logical sense to say, well, I've got my retail operations, my physical stores, so therefore I'm going to organize that into into one division, and I'm going to have every store as its manager, and I'm going to create regions, and then I have, you know, my different channel here, but here's my web channel, here's whatever. And because as a business, that's convenient for me, it helps me organize it, but that's the exact opposite of what me as the customer, what I want, right? Because I don't care about what makes it easier for you to do business. I care about what makes it easier for me to do business with you. And so to me, when I think of omni-channel, it's this complete flip of saying, okay, in the shoes of the customer, how do I make this the best experience possible? And, you know, and flowing through that. So I love that idea of the, what would you say, omnipresent? Is that?
Yes. So yeah, as a customer, I'm omnipresent within all channels. Right. And I think that's a key piece. And you know, the technology part of it is actually reasonably mature. We've had federated identity for 20 years, and the ability to bring those together is reasonably mature. But to your point, which I think is the central feature of the challenge, is it's the organizational structure itself, which lends itself to these silos across all of the channels that keep them naturally separated. And even if they're sharing content, the question is that enough, you know, to be able to deliver a seamless experience or an omni-channel experience? And I think that's the big challenge.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so. Now, to bring this back to, I mean, obviously you guys are in the business of managing the content and the experience. You know, so it's easy to think about this in terms of retail, and I can easily see people that are listening going, yeah, okay, but that's, you know, we're not in the retail business. So I guess a two-part question here. The first is, when we talk about omni-channel in this broader sense, how do you see it playing out for, you know, for every industry, or, you know, how is it that everyone should be thinking about this? And then, using retail as our example, why is it so hard? Why is it that organizations have struggled so much at actually achieving this? So, I mean, what's your take on that?
There's a couple things. So we talked about the organizational piece. The other side of it, though, is if you look at so let's just take digital for a second. Let's assume we're not dealing with storefronts, to your point. If you look at the way digital content is organized inside an organization today, in many ways, and you know, coming out of our industry, there have been a different system that managed your website that was different from the system that managed a portal where you did transactions, particularly, that might also be different from where the intranet is. How the content for the internet, and is also different from where the partner marketing people deal with distribution, be it resellers or distributors. Right. And so the ability to unify that content and be able to deliver a consistent message across all of those channels alone becomes very, very difficult for a lot of companies, because that's their legacy. And the ability to integrate all those systems actually is prohibitive, and I think from the standpoint of trying to make a business case is difficult. So if we think of this DXP that we focused on with Orchestra CMS, it's really around being able to deliver all of the digital channels from a single content store. And then it makes it a lot easier from there to say, I now know about you as an individual, and I can make sure that all the stakeholders in this experience delivery are informed. So my distributors are getting the same messaging that my employees are getting, that the customers are getting. And so you get a very,
you know, I'm chuckling because that sounds so simple. And the number of times that I've been on and again, I think one of the things I want to make sure we don't miss here is that this is much more when we talk about the primacy of the customer. We talk about this universality of the flow, that, you know, the the moments of truth that, you know, from a marketing perspective, is that it's not just about the transaction. It's not just about the sale. It's about every aspect of engagement, from the beginning of the exploration all the way to, I've now made the purchase, and I now need support, or I'm just sharing with my friends even. But the number of times where I've been on a support call or something, and I'm literally sending whoever I'm talking to links to their own website or to their own, because I have different information than what they're giving me, or in many cases better information, and I'm having to, point them in the direction of how to find the stuff we're talking about because they don't have access to what I have access to. I mean, it's staggering to me that, well, that sounds simple, that everyone should have that same information so that we're communicating in the same way to remove that friction of the experience and of the transaction, whatever stage of it might be. It really is a lot harder than it sounds, isn't it?
No, absolutely it is. And I think, there's both this sort of message that we're trying to deliver in terms of representing the brand, but there's also this understanding of who I am speaking with or who I'm dealing with. So when we get into the omnichannel discussion, it's also being able to bring that back office forward and combine that with CRM and customer support and marketing information, and being able to take that knowledge and use it to customize and personalize that digital experience. So that's all part and parcel of it. And until those systems become somewhat unified, it becomes very, very difficult from an architectural perspective to do it, let alone an organizational one. So those really, I think, are the two. There's the organization and the architectural challenge that companies are facing as they try to figure out how to deal with people individually, or deal with customers or stakeholders of any kind individually. It could be a not-for-profit, to your earlier point. So if you take the retail example we used earlier, you've got a challenge there of lots of, maybe just lots of different ways retail is conducted through franchisees or directly. You've got a lot of casual part-time labor that turns over frequently. So this ability to be able to train and make sure people have all that information at their fingertips becomes ever more important to keep driving consistency in a sea of really was a lot of change in turnover.
Right. I mean, because I think there's two, I always look at, as much as we're all about agile digital transformation and we're talking a lot about a whole bunch of different technologies, and at the end, it all comes down to automation. The first question I always ask somebody is, do you need to automate that? What is the business outcome? What is the business benefit? And one of the chief drivers of automation should always be the complexity and the volume of data, right? Because the more, if having more and better data is going to help you serve your customer better, then you should do that. But as you get more and better data, it gets harder and harder to manage. And so a lot of what I think you're pointing out here is kind of two intersecting challenges. One, I need to know more and more about the customer. I need to have better context of where they've been and how they've been interacting with me as the business, right? So that I can engage with them the way they want to engage with. But it's also about, that means I've got all this content and it needs to be organized and managed in a way that makes sense. Because I make a joke when I talk about information that people think more information is always better. Well, it isn't really true. In fact, if you watch these movies, legal teams that are fighting something out, and the one legal team discovers that they've got some nugget that's going to sink their case, and they have to, because of discovery, they have to expose it. What do? They send them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of boxes of material, because they know that they can effectively bury that one nugget, the piece of information that actually matters, in this sea of data, right? And I think that's kind of the challenge that organizations have when it comes to content, right? Is that there's so much content out there. We're creating more content every single day, that the piece of content or the piece of information that might be vital to that customer on their journey can get completely lost and buried. And so as an organization, there's some challenges with that, right? How do you manage that onslaught of content and engagement opportunities to make this whole idea of omnichannel actually work?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and I want to add another dimension to the omnichannel. We've very much been talking about that channel from the perspective of the company out, and so multiple channels of engagement with a customer. If we now flip it around and say, back to your point on content, we have omnichannel on the way in, with content coming into an organization. So if we go back to even 5 years ago and just think digitally only for a second, there was a small group that would be your digital team that managed that website that you were running publicly, that may include commerce or not, and they were really doing a lot of the organization and even authoring of that content. It was primarily confined to that small group. Now you see content originating from many, many different channels, and often that team now becomes a bottleneck. So now we have this notion of distributed authoring that's going well beyond that notion of a small team in the beginning. And then you also have channels which you're actually just curating. So you're sourcing content that is no longer coming, that's originating within your control. And so all of that is now coming together, and it needs to be managed. And so the integrity of doing all of that becomes much more complex. And if you look at traditional systems, they've really been built around the idea of that small digital team. So the workflow has been, me sitting next to you kind of thing, and moving content back and forth through an origination process or an authoring process. Now we need a system where that workflow and governance can be pushed out to a much broader audience, and that curation can happen much more broadly. And so because the key to all of this is, it's great that we can deliver this single experience down many channels and out to the marketplace. It's really important that what we deliver has integrity, so that the content is on message and that the experience is consistent, and that from the standpoint of governance, that's absolutely critical, because that's an immediate reflection of your brand. If you then add a layer on top of that, where you're in regulated industries like life sciences or banking and insurance, there's a whole challenge there around compliance and auditability. And so the system really has to be able to not just deliver the experience, it also has to be able to capture and organize all of the content that's going to be part of that experience with utter integrity. And so that's where governance and compliance and auditability become absolutely critical to the management of content.
So I want to get to the specifics of workflow and governance and how that plays, because I think this is, let's get the rubber on the road, so to speak. But I want to make a point, because again, I think people sometimes, slough this off a little bit. And this is such a simple example, and yet so demonstrative, I think. So I belong to I live in kind of wine country area, and belong to a membership, or whatever you call it, where we get a bottle a month or whatever, and we can go there and get free tastings and stuff. And part of the reason we picked the winery that we did, there were a few reasons, but one of it was because they actually executed this well. The number of times that we would go to these other wineries and they'd give us something simple, a menu, right? But because this was constantly changing, and to your point, they had the winemakers and they had the people in charge of the tasting room and all the stuff. And this is, if you think of it in an enterprise context, so simple. And yet, the number of places we went, they would give us a menu that was out of date, or the number of times that my girlfriend and I would each get menus and they'd be different. And we'd say, well, wait a minute, which is this wine available, or is that? And it was amazing how bad of a taste it left, because it's kind of sullied this experience, right? And it was just about the flow of content. It was about managing the fact of, do we have the right content delivered on the right day at the right time, so that I can place my order, kind of a thing. And that such a simple little thing had such a negative impact on the experience that it literally cost a couple of these wineries, our membership, which is, not an insignificant amount of money. And so if you now multiply this into an enterprise that is dealing with, to your point, now potentially hundreds of people involved in the flow of content, and the stakes are so much bigger, and the reality is they probably don't even know it, right? If that content is not managed effectively because of this kind of asynchronicity of the experience, of the fact that someone's consuming that content and is having that negative experience, and you may not even know it. This is really important stuff, right? Have you seen other examples, maybe that from a more enterprise example, that you've seen around that?
Absolutely. I think you raise a good point on very much a brand and customer experience perspective. Now, if we overlay some regulatory on top of that and say that, that same thing happens in a pharmaceutical situation where you content gets out into the wild, and now it's going not just to your website, it's going down many channels to customers, and it may misrepresent a product. That could happen in financial services or life science, pharma and life sciences as an example. Now there's significant legal implications. So first of all, you might kill somebody in the worst case, but you're also going to get some kind of regulatory and legal challenge, and so and all of that stuff impacts your brand. So if you think about it, there's many ways to manifest a branding disaster, that they go from the morbid all the way out to just simply a really bad customer experience like you had with those wineries. So I think, the governance of that content, which includes the way it's originated and how it's managed through that origination or authoring process, right out to how it's delivered to the end stakeholders is super important. The other side of it is that we're also, if you take your winery example, what happens if I'm now going to a store that's a reseller of that wine?
Right.
And now that content that you got that was bad at the winery is also going to be pushed out to the distribution side. That impacts your customer experience at the distributor. It also impacts the distributor's experience with customers coming in and complaining about inaccurate information or poor customer experience. And so the ability for this the beauty of being able to manage these touch points is your reach is incredible. The bad news is if you make a mistake, your reach is incredible.
Right, exactly.
They can multiply, right? So it truly is a double-edged sword in this regard. So I think that's the content, the governance and management of content through its life cycle is absolutely critical. And in the traditional content management space, has really been a little bit secondary to the sort of the whiz bang of how things look. And we've taken a very different approach from that perspective.
Well, and I think that's one of the big takeaways. Right now we're still got quite a bit to talk about, but I always try to identify what are the big messages, the big takeaways, and I think one of them is the very first thing is we need to understand that a digital experience platform is about a whole lot more than just marketing. To everything you just talked about, it affects this huge swath of your business because so much of how we do business is now digitally driven, and increasingly content driven specifically. Then the ability to manage that, yes, it's clearly important from an experience and from a branding perspective, but it has very deep implications across the board. So let's talk a little bit more tactically here. So we talked about why workflow or why governance is important, but maybe you can explain a little bit of it exactly how. I mean, what does that look like when we talk about, that one of the keys to building this digital experience platform and embracing this idea of the primacy of the customer and creating this true omni-channel experience? We talked about why it's important, we talked about why it's hard, and now we've talked about the fact that you need workflow and governance to make it work. So I guess the question is why exactly and how? How does that actually happen?
Right. So the key piece is that and again, I'm going to look at it all the way from a highly regulated back to just an organization very concerned about its brand, because they really are tightly coupled. So if you think about the origins of content, it is now much more diverse than it used to be. And again, as I said earlier, much of that is occurring outside of your domain. So it isn't just your small digital team that's originating content. It can be coming from across an organization. And if we think about digital experience, that includes employees, right? And includes partners as well. Right. So the content is now being originated outside of the purview of that digital team, because it's really being pushed down to where the expertise lives. And again, it could be anything from HR on a social intranet all the way out to product development teams in terms of originating documentation that's pushed out to developer sites. So it can go really through the whole gambit of an organization and then beyond. You may find that there's really interesting reading. Kristen talked about the monitoring the ecosystem there at the beginning of the webinar. There's a lot of different sources of information. So the key piece is that there has to be a workflow that's very tightly managed, that's very auditable, that allows us to ensure that wherever that content originates, A, it's easy to originate it, but B, it's also easy to make sure that based on roles of individuals within the organization and across the organization, that content is being reviewed. It's being updated, because everything from your Google search results to, again, legal implications on the other end, all of those things are going to manifest in terms of how you manage the content over its life cycle. So there's the origination of it inside and outside your organization. There's the workflow and vetting of that content as it goes through that workflow, where you can see every step that's fully auditable and compliant. And then there's the notion of managing that content over its life cycle. So is it being reviewed frequently? Is it being updated? How do we know a piece should be updated? So all of that sort of life cycle management aspect is also critical. And so those are all things that really are more formally a true business process automation type set of functions, as opposed to just simply, you wrote something and I approved it. You may have to have legal compliance and a whole series of groups across an organization review content based on where it came from, based on the implications, based on regulatory, based on a number of things. So there has to be a very robust engine sitting underneath this content management and digital experience platform that allows that to occur, and then can audit it.
Right, because you start thinking about it and you realize that not all content is created equal, right? I mean, to your point, that you need the ability to apply complex business rules to it to say, if it's this type of content, then this is how I'm going to manage it. And to me, one of the key things that when organizations are looking at this is that because content, and I mean, I'm using that term pretty universally, right? I mean, as you talked about, this comes in lots of different forms and flavors, right? So I don't want anyone to think we're just talking about, say a website or whatever, but that when we're dealing with this content, that it is so critical that we deliver it. And let's not forget, it's still about speed. It's the quicker I can get and update that content, get it out into the wild, get it to whoever needs. And to your point, it's not just a customer, it's the customers, the employees, the partners. Get it wherever it needs to be as quickly as possible. That remains critical. So when we talk about workflow and governance, it's not as simple as simply saying, I need the ability to stick it in and have a set of defined processes and approvals. And yes, that's all important, but it also needs to be easy and fast, because I need to be able to move it through just the appropriate level of control and governance. Need to be able to move it through this workflow where it's actually easier to go through the workflow than it is to sidestep it. And so this becomes a challenging balancing act to make this work when you're also dealing with this onslaught of content and you need to continually get it out to where it needs to get to, right?
No, absolutely. And so one of the things that the workflow and governance engine needs to be able to do is, to your point, with the urgency of trying to get content out and the iterative nature of digital communications, you need to make sure that the workflow engine is able to do things like notice that this hasn't been acted on in some period of time and reroute that to somebody else to get it acted on faster. So to your point, it doesn't change the experience of the user within that workflow, but what it does do is dramatically, it's actually to monitor and ensure that that workflow is moving at a given rate of speed that's appropriate to the content itself. Some things require more compliance and legal review, but a lot of it can go through the system very, very quickly, and it needs to be able to differentiate and make sure that that flow is occurring, at speed while maintaining the integrity of it. So that's a critical piece you bring up. Point.
So, and I think that there's a term that we might use, because I think that the other thing that can muddy the water here is that when we think about the digital experience, it is, as we've been talking about, it's multifaceted. And to your previous points, there's a lot of different systems out there that can play a role in that. And so in order for you to actually make this work, one of the things that we certainly believe at Intellyx is that you have to have this end-to-end viewpoint, that you have to be creating an engagement platform that allows you to manage this. Because once I always tell people that, when I talked about process in my early days, I would explain to them, says, you can have the fastest relay team in the world, but whether they win or lose isn't going to be based on whether or not those four runners are the fastest runners. It's going to be how well they execute those handoffs, because if they drop that baton every single time, that's where this thing falls down. And when we're dealing with any of this kind of stuff, the more handoffs you get, the harder this becomes to manage. And so this idea of creating that end-to-end engagement platform, something that is kind of holistically integrated, becomes critical. I mean, I'm assuming you agree with that, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So I mean, how do you see that? And specifically, is there anything that you guys either do or that organizations should be approaching to kind of adopt that idea of end-to-end engagement?
Yeah, no. From our perspective, Charlie, this is absolutely essential. When we made the decision 7 years ago to build Orchestra CMS natively on Salesforce, we did it for a couple of reasons. One was we really saw Salesforce as an emergent platform, and again, we're going back to 2010, that really represented the next generation of enterprise IT services delivery, because it really was an incredibly flexible platform that did much more than CRM. Obviously, it's known for CRM marketing and customer support, but those are just applications running on a much more broadly flexible platform. So building natively means we become part of the platform, which means we see everything and have access to everything. So from our perspective, everything on Salesforce is as much content as the traditional digital layer that we're managing over top of that. And to allow a business user to very rapidly deliver that to the marketplace in a highly iterative manner without getting IT intervention, we saw as really a fundamental shift in that notion of end-to-end. At the same time that we were doing that, we also saw Salesforce take an approach of being what they called an agility layer in an organization. So organizations that built these very large, complex back office systems, which were really required, especially in Fortune 100, 500 companies, to manage the business at a transactional level, because back to the integrity of content, reporting financials for a public company is with integrity, as we've all seen, is rather critical. So as we began building our product on Salesforce, we also saw Salesforce increasingly being plugged into that back office and bringing critical information forward into the platform that traditionally salespeople and marketers and customer support people could use, but also applications like ours could use. And so all of a sudden, in a very native way that requires no IT intervention, we can see everything on Salesforce, including all that back office information, all the customer information, the way everybody is defined, and the kind of relationship customers, partners, and employees have with that organization. And a business user can literally configure that and personalize a digital experience based on that right out to all of the digital endpoints. And like everybody else, 7 years ago, we started with the web, but today it's across all of the channels. And I think that's absolutely critical going forward, because every time you create a handoff or an integration, you create complexity, and you begin to take those business users who are the content drivers out of the mix and bringing more onerous IT processes into the mix.
Right. No, I completely agree, and I think there's always a balance and there's always a fine line, but I think it is so critical, because I come from enterprise IT, right? And so I remember so many times where people talk about, oh, well, it's just a simple integration and it's no big deal, and we would go and do that, and then once you start doing it at volume and at scale, and then the systems continue to evolve, it just becomes more and more complex, and it increasingly becomes this weak link, and sometimes there's no avoiding it, but I mean, this idea of creating this end-to-end perspective on how you view it, because I think it becomes critical, I think, because of the thing that maybe we don't recognize, and again, this is more than marketing, but when we talk about this idea of the experience, and when, the digital experience is often translated to the customer experience, but the reality is, we're as organizations, we're in a fight for the best partners. We're in a fight for the best employees, and literally, especially as millennials start rising. My son is actually, he's 19, and he's kind of getting into this realm, and it was been fascinating to watch him choose everything from the university he chose to the jobs he's taking, because he's all these internship programs, and to see how he is literally evaluating their use of technology and how hard or easy it's going to make him or enable him to be successful as a criteria by which he's assessing whether or not that's a job he's going to take, or I mean, our employees, our teams are looking at how we're leveraging technology and saying, is this an organization I want to be associated with? So I mean, when we talk about the digital experience, it's not just about this kind of oh, cool marketing thing. It's really about the fact that our organizations and how we operate and how we curate this experience is defining our success in ways that are not immediately visible, right? Because how we look at that has such a dramatic impact. And so I think that it becomes this thing, this critical aspect to understand, that having that end-to-end engagement, to have that platform, it becomes not, which is why we're so invested or so kind of hot on this idea of the digital experience platform, because it's not just this is a nice simple evolution of the new way to market. This becomes, we believe, central, and this is why the whole white paper that we wrote, central to this idea of digital transformation. So, I mean, as I mean, feel free to react to that, but I mean, as we kind of get close to wrapping this up, is there anything specific that we haven't covered that you think that folks here should be paying attention to and listening to?
No, I think we've covered a lot of it really well. I think to bring it all back to create a narrative, if you will, across the four main topic areas of the primacy of the customer, omnichannel, content, workflow, and governance and engagement. I think if we look at that from a narrative perspective, you started off by saying very accurately that there's been in recent maybe 2 or 3 years, a seismic shift in the power structure between a customer and a partner. That also, as unemployment rates continue to drop, and to your most recent point, it also includes employees and partners, because they have more choices, more places to go. You know, the market is much stronger for them as well. And so the primacy really of everybody you need to engage with is actually really, really critical, and their ability to make decisions around that engagement, and then be able to drive those decisions across a much broader audience and really impact your brand are absolutely critical. So, you know, the ability to recognize that in the way you organize your business and you organize your activities around the marketplace is important. The ability to amplify that through all of the channels that are both delivering content to you as well as content out to the marketplace, the ability to ensure the integrity of that communication, and the notion of being able to leverage that from an end-to-end perspective. I think those are really the key points. I mean, I think you've covered it very well, Charlie. I don't think from my perspective, there's always a lot we could blow out into many different conversations around all four of these topics, but I think given the time frame, we've covered everything I'd like to see.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, clearly there's obviously a lot under the covers. I mean, I think that the thing that I hope people take from this is, understand that this represents this fundamental shift, as you pointed out, that you have to be creating this omni-channel, this true omni-channel kind of approach, and to do so, you need to deal with the blocking and tackling of things like workflow and governance, and looking at this from an end-to-end perspective. And that if you don't, you know, you're going to have a pretty difficult time with it. So, but I think where I'd like to leave this with everyone, and I know we kind of blew through this, so I think we may have a few questions that we'll try to answer after the fact. But if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to put them out there, and we'll get back to you afterward. But I think that the last important piece here is, you know, there's this rush of technology. I mean, it's an amazing time being an IT guy, being a technologist. This is arguably one of the most exciting times to be in this space. I just feel like there's this constant change. There's new stuff coming out every single day. And while that's amazing, it's kind of like the problem with the lawyers that we're talking about. It's also easy to get, you know, crushed under the weight of all of this new technology, and even more than just technology, these new ideas and approaches. Like, because really, you know, the digital experience platform is certainly, it's technology driven, but it's really an idea. It's an approach. It's changing the way you look at how you engage with your customers and your employees and your partners, and therefore how you create and distribute and create, manage, and distribute content to them as part of that experience. And so I think it's really, really important for folks to kind of get their head around the vision. Where does this end up? You know, if this makes sense to me and I start going down this road, what does that look like? And I think that, you know, is in maybe two form factors, right? One is from an organizationally, you know, what is the business value, the business benefit of it? But what does it also mean to me as maybe someone who's listening to this, and from even a career standpoint, or, you know, what my job looks like? I mean, how would you kind of cast that vision into the future for them, Doug?
I think, you know, it's a great question, and I think this is something that's still emerging. But if we really look at it, and you brought up a really good point, Charlie, it starts with the organization. So I agree with you. I'm an IT guy as well, and it's a great time to be alive in this space in terms of the amount of change and the opportunities being created by technology. But if we think about it, the technology is really an outcome of a new reality, which is that the businesses need to organize around the primacy of the company, or the customer, sorry, whoever that customer might be. So it really starts with organizational development, organizational structure, which really isn't a technical area. It's really something that's really, really critical as a foundational piece to being able to transform. So if you look at a number of the analysts, and then you look at people like McKinsey, who write extensively on this, one of the biggest challenges to transforming a business is the notion that you've got to have the right organizational structure. You have to get rid of those silos. You have to be able to bring things together around that primacy of the customer, or the customer at the center of everything you're doing. The technology then will support that. What I think a lot of people get mixed up about is the technology is seen as a bit of a silver bullet, but if you don't solve the organizational and even the sort of vision and mission aspects of the need to circle the customer, if you will, then the technology is really not going to help you. It's just going to be another point solution. If you're a technologist, so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, around helping to transform organizations. The next piece, I think, is the technology piece, which is, once we've got that foundational piece in place, what are the opportunities to engage customers in really interesting and exciting new ways across all of the digital and the physical channels? We've been, obviously we're focused on digital on this call, but from my perspective, the in-store experience is as important and needs to be informed by digital as the actual experience directly with the customer. So there's a phenomenal opportunity in marketing technology and IT in general around delivering those systems and processes that are going to allow us to create that seamless experience for customers. So really, it's a very much an end-to-end opportunity, I think, for the people on this call.
Yep.
In that order.
Yep. It's a great time. Yep, absolutely. So, all right. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap this up and hand this back to Kristen to bring us home.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so there doesn't appear to be any questions. I know we covered a lot. As Charlie mentioned, if you leave this webinar and a light bulb moment happens where you have a question, feel free to reach out to us. We really do want to continue this dialogue. And I want to be mindful of time. I know we just have 6 minutes left, but I would not be a good marketing person if I didn't do at least one shameless plug for some of the activity that Stantive has coming up. So first, Dreamforce. So if you or your colleagues are going to be at Dreamforce, we definitely want to connect with you. We're going to be all over the campus this year. And so if you want to connect with us, I do have the booth information kind of up on the screen, and this will be shared with you after. But you can also visit our website, and we have a Dreamforce microsite that has kind of all of our activity, parties that we're going to be involved in, content sessions, meeting space, all of that. So if you are going to be there, I will be there, Doug will be there. So for sure, get connected with us there. The other thing too is a month or so ago, we did a spotlight series with our product manager, Jeff Larkin, on OMNICHANNEL. And some of the feedback that we got specifically from kind of customers and partners was, how do we make OMNICHANNEL possible, and can we see a deeper dive of the Orchestra CMS APIs? So thank you so much for your feedback. We heard you. And so post Dreamforce, when everything sort of settles, we're just trying to lock down resources and dates, but we are going to be doing a more technical session that really expands on what we've talked about here around OMNICHANNEL and really making it real. And so look for that. You can also, on our website at our resource hub, we do have an ebook that outlines all of the APIs that are available. So you can definitely give that a read. And then last but not least is our newsletter. So there's a lot of things happening here at Stantive, a lot of events and webinars and content that's happening. So if you want to keep up to date on everything Stantive related, we do have a monthly newsletter that you can sign up for. I'm sure most of the people on this call, especially customers and partners, are actually already signed up, but we promise it's just one email a month. We do not spam you, but it is a really great opportunity just to keep up to date with things that are happening in the ecosystem, webinars like this that are coming up, and just making sure that you're kind of connected to all things Stantive and Salesforce ecosystem and partner related. So I just wanted to take a minute just to go through that. And again, this will all be sent as a follow-up. So any of the information I've just gone through will be available with hyperlinks and all of that stuff to get connected. So I think that's it from my end. Obviously, huge thank you to Doug and Charlie for doing that and walking through. I think there was some really incredible insights there. And again, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to any one of us. And then, of course, thank you to everyone who registered and took the time out of their day to sit with us for the last hour. So again, thank you so much, everyone, and hope everyone has an amazing day.